Chapter 16. Breathless with his fears and haste, Huan reached the summit of the hill which overlooked the fatal field. Thank heaven! Some still live, he cried, and gaining new vigor from the sight, he hurried on. Suddenly his eye fell upon the figure of the gentle victim, who stood smiling at death, as if weary of the world, and longing for that blessed sleep from which she knew she would rise with new life, in the morning. In the quickness of his love, Huan felt it was his sister Anthe, and, with a wild shriek of horror, fell to the earth. Then, as he knelt, he prayed, with all the zeal of his bitter agony, that the spirit of kindness would look down with pity upon men, and so enlighten their understandings that, seeing the wondrous mechanism of creation, they might know that he who made the world moved and governed it by wiser and more kindly laws than they, in their darkness, imagined. And the blessed spirit of kindness heard the prayer, and the work of destruction was stayed, and Anthe and her poor crazy companions in death were spared. For, as Huan gazed on the plain beneath, and beheld the executioner hold down his torch to fire the reeds, he saw the faggots, as they kindled, send up a smoke so dense that men were blinded by it. And the fumes of the witch fires hung above the city like a black cloud, till darkness overshadowed all the land. Presently, the sun shone high above, and, piercing the thick fog, a beam of blessed light struggled through the universal gloom. And, when the first ray fell on earth, the people shut their eyes and turned from its dazzling brightness, blinking at the unknown light, as if, instead of the smiling earth, they had been living in a dungeon. Then, as the magic went on, and ray after ray shot down from above, the mist gave before them, and, as the sun shone full upon the demon fires, one by one they died away, till the world, which but a little while since was red with the glare of bloody flames, was now golden with the light of heaven. And then the sunburned faggots began to bud with a new life, and the stake and gibbet to put forth boughs and leaves, each growing and growing, till a mighty tree, laden with the daintiest fruits, stood, luxuriant with life, where the ghastly beam of death had lately been. At first, men looked with fear upon the tree, and dreaded to touch it, for they said, "It is the evil tree of knowledge, and will destroy them that eat of it." Still many hungered for the food, but the priests strove to keep them back, while those that, despite their pious threats, dared to gather the fruit, they branded as blasphemers, and put a mark upon them, so that their neighbors might shun them, as they would serpents, for the poison of their tongues. But at last all men grew greedy for the fruit of the goodly tree, and those that feasted on it had the film taken from their eyes, and the wonders and the beauty of the universe were laid bare to them, for they saw into the remotest corners of space and the deepest depths of the earth and the sea. And the minds of the wisest entered and pervaded the minds of their less gifted brethren, till men learned to read with kindlier eyes the hearts and brains of their fellowmen. And, while the feasters partook of the blessed fruit themselves, they gave freely to all around, and yet were the richer rather than the poorer for the gift. Then, as the magic still went on, the prison gates were flung open, and herds of wild and savage beasts rushed out, scaring the populace before them. And, as they ate the fruit, the animals grew human, and for the first time were recognized as men. On this the bars and chains fell from the prison doors and windows, while the prisons themselves were turned to hospitals and schools, and, where before the jailer and the headsman had governed and destroyed, the teacher and the doctor guided and healed. Then, as the crazy things, free from the stake, were taken to the hospitals, the children of the poor were gathered from the streets and byways, to be led to the schools. The orphan, the foundling, and the outcast, the children of one and the children of crime, the cleanly and the ragged, all found shelter, knowledge, and good counsel there. And Huan blessed the spirit of kindness for the goodly work, and the people laughed and wept for very joy, for they saw God, nature, and their fellow creatures in a new guise. Chapter 17. Now when the king saw the magic change that had been wrought in the hearts and minds of his people, his joy knew no bounds, and he cried, "It is the dwarf that hath done it all. Go, bring him and his blind sister to me, that I may do honor to them and supplicate their pardon." But Huan and Anthe were away, weeping over their raving father, and when the message of the king was brought them, they said, Let us straightway go to him, and at his feet beseech him to take the galling chains from the poor old man's limbs." So they hastened into the presence of the king. And immediately, when Alpheus saw them, he cast himself at their feet, imploring their forgiveness. Huan raised him up, and then the old monarch folded them to his arms, and, praising God that their lives had been spared, called them his dear children, till his tears choked his words. Then he commanded Huan and his sister to say how the people and their king could pay the heavy debt of gratitude they owed them, and he told them to speak boldly, for all that he could give them, he said, would not be a tithe of their due. And he bade Anthe be the first to name the reward she wished. Whereupon the blind girl, true to her new nature, besought the king that he would liberate her maniac father from his chains. But Ophelas answered her not, and turned to Huan to know the boon that he desired. The dwarf, bowing, demanded of the king that he would remove the chains not from one madman only, but from all. Then the monarch grew sad, and as he turned his head from them he replied, Nay, ask of me my richest province, and it shall be yours. You know not the danger of what you seek. Though we have learnt we should not take the lives of the mad, still it is but meet we should bind them, lest in their madness they take ours. But Huan urged that, though the insane were deaf to reason, they were not dead to feeling, saying, Kindness spake to the heart and not to the head. And he reminded Ophelas that their work of mercy was but half complete. They had removed the maniacs from the stake to the hospital, it was true, but though they had learnt to save them from the felon's death, still they had yet to learn to strip them of the felon's chains. But Ophelas, as Huan entreated him to have faith and kindness and grant him the boon he asked, told the dwarf again and again that he dare not listen to him. So Huan and his blind sister, both sad at heart, returned to the city, to forget the sorrows they themselves felt in comforting the sorrows of others. Meanwhile, the people of Aswan became fanatics in the new creed, and almost worshipped the dwarf and his sister, blessing them, as they passed their doors, or surrounding them in crowds, and loading them with presents, so that none ever received such honor before. And the gifts that the grateful people heaped upon them Huan and Anthe turned to good also. For Huan would bring back to their homes the wives that had left their husbands, and Anthe the daughters that had fled from their fathers, while each, to make the return more welcome, would add the presents they had received, and so re-establish love and goodwill between those that lived unhappily, till at length people would guard as a treasure the cup from which the dwarf or his blind sister had sipped, for everywhere they were welcomed as the peacemakers. Then the priests, embracing in their turn the new creed of kindness, and feeling for the oppression of the people, from the arrogance and rapacity of the nobles, strove to promote universal love and goodwill, by establishing throughout the land a holy covenant, which they called the truce of God, by which men bound themselves by oath not to enjoy the fruits of property usurped from others, nor to take revenge for any injury, nor, above all, to use any deadly weapon against their fellow creature. And thousands flocked to swear observance to it, for, in reward, the priests promised them a resting place in paradise and universal peace on earth. And so the nobles ceased to war among themselves, and the poor were no longer oppressed, while over each man's door the olive branch was hung, in token of his reverence for the truce of God. In the midst of the peace the trump of war was heard, and the host that Aleph had led forth was seen returning over the distant hills. But their banners were hung down, their drums were muffled, and each man's head drooped upon his breast as he marched along, for they grieved for the young prince, their leader, who had been wounded in the strife, and they feared his days were numbered. Then the whole city, as the sad news was spread abroad, streamed from their houses, and followed the troops, sorrowing for the young warrior, whose valor won a boy they had almost worshipped. And, as they marched silently after the soldiers, each man cursed within himself the ghastly trade of war. When the mournful tidings reached Ophelas' ears, he ran to meet his dying boy, and wept over him, saying, Woe to my grey hairs! Woe to my people! And must the prop of my old age be dashed from under me, and the hope of the nation be blighted, when the harvest time was so near? But, though there was much sorrowing for Aleph, none sorrowed more than she who had suffered the most from him, for Anthe, now that Aleph's life was in peril, felt all her love for him return, and, forgetting the wrong he had done her, she thought of him only as the generous boy that had won her girlish heart. And she besought Evoi, that she might tend upon him in his hour of danger, so that, with a woman's gentle hand, she might strive to hold back the life that struggled to be gone. And, when her prayer was granted, she sat day and night beside the prince, thanking God that, in the delirium of his fever, he knew not the hand that dressed his wound and bathed his burning brow. Then, as those skilled in medicine came, she would listen breathlessly to each word they spake, and beg of them, ere they went, to tell her that all hope was not yet fled, and that by care his life might yet be saved. And, when they turned away and answered her not, she would return to Aleph's couch, to tend him with redoubled tenderness, so that her love might compass that which their art would fail in. But still Anthe tended him in vain, for, despite her care, the wound grew worse, and Aleph, with the torment of it, knew no rest. Each day the doctors told the king that the prince must lose his arm or die, yet, when the downcast Ophelas bade them save his son and take it, They would answer that they dare not yet awhile, for if they took it then, the youth would surely perish. As Anthe heard the sick Olaf moan and writhe with his pangs day after day, and night after night, knowing neither rest nor sleep, she bethought her of her brother's magic power. So she sent for Huan, and on her knees begged of him to have mercy on her and him she loved, saying, "If kindness be, as you have taught us, all-powerful like the God from whom it springs, oh let it, like him who sent blessed sleep, to give new life to man and ease him of his pains, teach men the way to give slumber to the suffering, and rob nature of its bitterest agony." And Huan took pity on the poor girl, and besought the spirit to grant her prayer. Immediately an invisible vapor arose, and, circling round the prince, bathed him in its blessed atmosphere. Then his eyelids drooped, while his groans died away, and he whose torments had let him know no rest for weeks, lay wrapped in the happy ease of slumber. And, as he slept, the shattered arm was taken from him, without a sigh to tell his suffering. And when, at night, Olaf woke from out his trance, and found the aching limb was gone, he called down blessings on all around for the holy rest he felt. Then, as he asked for water, he saw by the dim light of his chamber the figure of the blind girl standing, cup in hand, beside him, in instant answer to his wants. And, as the doom that he had cast upon her flashed across his guilty mind, he thought the spirit of the girl had come down from heaven to rebuke him for the cruel death he had condemned her to, for on the face of her, whose worst enemy he had been, there shone so sweet a smile, and in the cup she bore Olaf read so loving a reproach, that she seemed one of the angel host flown back to earth to pay with good the evil he had heaped upon her. And, softened by his sickness, Olaf wept, and begged forgiveness of the heavenly spirit that stood beside him, praying her, for the love she once had borne him, and that he had flung aside, to mend his heart and so watch over him in this world that he might be fit to meet her in the next. Then Anthe blessed the suffering she had undergone, for the rich reward they had brought her, and thought herself more than paid for the bitter cruelty of Olaf's hate and the return of Olaf's love. And she could not speak for the tears of joy that streamed down her face. And, when the repentant prince discovered that it was Anthe herself, and learned from a sister how she had tended him in his anguish, the gratitude he felt for all her loving care made him see the kindly girl more beauteous than ever, for the pure light of her chastened spirit shone from out the face whose beauty had fled, like a glowworm beneath a flower in the night. And his affection for her returned with a tenfold strength and truth, for, his boyish passion now over, his manly love began. And he besought her to let him atone for the wrongs that he had done her, by making good the vows that he alone had broken, and so give back the honor that she, in the faith of her love, had trusted to his keeping. But Anthe, though her heart swelled with joy at the healing words she heard, still would not listen to his entreaties, for she said it was too late now, and she bade him think of her as one dead, and look upon her as one new risen from the tomb of her own honor. Her new life, she told him, was wedded to charity, and henceforth she could love him only as she loved all those that suffered and were chastened by their sufferings. Chapter 18. No sooner was it known throughout Ocelon, that Prince Olaf's life had been saved through the prayers and tender care of her whom he had sought to destroy, than the love of the people for the blind girl grew greater than ever, and they got to look upon her as a saint, and one whose touch gave health and whose counsels happiness. And, as the wonder of the cure was magnified, as it traveled from house to house, people grew to place such faith in her powers, that women would stop one another in the market streets to speak of some new miracle she had wrought, and gossips would run into their neighbors' houses to tell, with uplifted hands and brows, of the last new marvel rumor attributed to her. At length it was whispered through the city that Anthe, grateful for the happiness she knew, had resolved to thank God at the prophet's tomb for the sparing of that life which was more precious to her than her own. And, as the time drew near for the starting of the caravan, the dervishes called upon those that had not yet made the pilgrimage to Medina, to put on the woolen garb and accompany the holy maid. Then the people, glad to make atonement for the wrongs they had heaped upon the blind girl, resolved to seek forgiveness and offer up prayers for Anthe's welfare at the prophet's tomb, and, where at other times men paid the hireling pilgrims to make the long and painful journey for them, they now refused with scorn the purchase of their prayers, but, full of enthusiasm, set the danger and the hardships of the way at defiance, and prepared to make the pilgrimage themselves. Each day the mosques were crowded with those that sought a blessing of the priest before setting out upon their pious journey, and each day the number of the pilgrims so increased that they were called the army of the Lord. As the time of their departure drew near, all Ocelon was in commotion, preparing to forsake their homes, kindred, and occupation, so that, at the prophet's tomb, they might lighten themselves of the heavy burden of their sins. And such was the fanatic fury of the city, that not a meteor shot across the heavens, but the people viewed it as a warning to those who lagged behind, and the next day 100 more made ready to swell the holy band. And when the day of leaving came, the chief of the dervishes led the pilgrim troop from the city, and Alphelas, with the prince and Huan by his side, went with them as well. And, as the multitude moved along, people came from their houses to cry, "Heaven guard the holy pilgrims!" and touched the garment of her who led them. And they would beg of those they knew among the band to bring them water from the holy well, or mold from the blessed tomb, to keep as charmed relics within their houses. And among the multitude were people of all classes, men, women, and even children, trudged along in droves. Some had camels bearing tents, and others mules laden with provisions for the way, while others had nothing, trusting to charity and the berries that ripen by the roadside for their subsistence. And the king and the high priest journeyed with them one day. And on the morning of the second, the dervish blessed the multitude, and Olive commanded his chosen band of Mamelukes to accompany the caravan and protect it as it traversed the lanes of the barbarian tribes, while Ophelas pressed the blind girl and her brother to his bosom, and, weeping over them, bade all his people love and honor them as his children. And then, bidding the pilgrims Godspeed, he returned with Huan and the prince, sorrowing, to the city, while the mighty multitude marched on, chanting in one loud, solemn voice, the praises of the Lord. But scarcely had 2 weeks passed, when tidings were brought to Aswan, that a wandering horde had swept down upon the pilgrim band, and, slaughtering the Mamelukes, had carried off Anthe and her unarmed companions. At first, the city gave no credit to the news. But they had little time for doubt, for, presently, there came a holy welly one that had journeyed with the multitude, his heart big with indignation at the insults they had suffered. And in every village through which he passed he preached the story of their wrongs so touchingly, and called for justice on the heathen in such stirring tones, that multitudes flocked from their houses, to listen to him as he came, and, fired with his eloquence, followed him when he went. So he entered the city with thousands in his train, each man calling as lustily as their leader for the blood of their heathen foes. The wali bent his way to the mosque, and sought out the dervishes. And, as he told them how the defenseless pilgrims had been plundered and beaten with stripes, and their countrymen massacred as they slept, and how the olive branch had been spat upon and the holy symbols of their religion trampled underfoot, the fury of the priests knew no bounds, and they all cried aloud for vengeance against the pagan hordes. And the chief of the dervishes wept, and bade his holy brethren each go preach the story of the pilgrims' wrongs, so that the whole country might be roused and the heathen be rooted out of the land. And immediately he summoned a council to make all preparations for the holy war. And he sat with closed doors for 7 days, whilst multitudes from far and near flocked into the town to hear the pious chief hold forth to the people. And they came in such vast numbers, that the fields around were encumbered with those who, unable to procure lodging in the city, pitched their tents under the trees and by the wayside, till the whole country seemed as one vast camp. The great square in front of the mosque became each instant more and more crowded, as the time drew nigh when the chief dervish was to exhort the multitude. At length the holy chief came forth, surrounded by all the priests and wells of the city, and as he lifted up his hands, every voice was hushed. He told the listening thousands of the miseries of the pilgrims, and, as the populace groaned, he cried aloud, "You who hear me, you who have received the true faith, and been endowed by Allah with power and strength and greatness of soul, I call upon you to stop the progress of the infidel and wipe out these impurities from the face of the earth. O brave people! Offspring of invincible fathers! You will not disgrace your ancient blood. Go! Forget the ties of father, wife and little ones. Go, armed with the sword and the book of life, and teach these barbarous pagans the blessed doctrines of peace and loving kindness among men. Go, then, in expiation of your sins, convert the heathen, and rest assured that imperishable glory shall be yours in the world that is to come." Then the crowd, moved by the words of the dervish, shouted with one voice, "God wills it! God wills it!" And when the dervish heard the cry, he turned to the multitude, and said, "It is Allah that speaks within you. If Allah had not been in your souls, you would not all have cried the same cry. It was Allah that spake the words by your lips. It was Allah that put the words into your hearts. Be that cry, then, your war cry in the combat. And, when the army of the compassionate, the merciful, rushes upon its foes, to teach them the blessings of brotherly love, cry but that one cry, God wills it! God wills it!" And the men, women and children echoed the words, and cried again, with one loud, furious voice, God wills it. God wills it. And whosoever, continued the dervish, is ready to bind himself to this holy cause, let him bear upon his breast the sign of the olive branch, as a token of the peaceful doctrines he would spread over the whole world. And let every man who wears this blessed badge outside his heart, carry within it this one resolve: death or new life to the heathen. And once more the war cry rose, and once more the air resounded with the shout of God wills it. God wills it. Then immediately the rich, the needy, the dissolute, the prudent, the young and the old, even women and children, and the halt and the lame, enrolled themselves by thousands under the banner of the Lord. But the zeal of none, and all that zealous multitude, was greater than the zeal of Aleph, for he, moved by the priests and fired by his own love, felt a double ardor in the cause. And he vowed that he himself would lead the people on, and, if Anthe still lived, either rescue her from her savage foes, or lose the life that she had saved. In every village the clergy were busy, promising eternal bliss to those who fought for the glory of the olive branch, and denouncing all those who refused or even hesitated to raise the sword in its defense. Every debtor who joined the sacred host was freed from the claims of the creditor, however just, and no man who wore the sign of the olive branch could be stayed for any crime, even though it were robbery or murder. And it was agreed that a tax, called the pagan's tithe, and consisting of 1/10 part of all possessions, should be enforced from every believer who was either unable or unwilling to help to root the heathen out of the land, while those who refused or could not pay the penalty were to become the bondsmen and absolute property of the noble on whose ground they lived. Among all classes of men the priests preached death to the infidel. One weekly went through the villages, announcing that the prophet, in a vision, had bidden him stir up the shepherds and tillers of the soil to the defense of the true faith. And thousands flocked around him, ready to follow him wherever he should lead, so that the pastures and the cornfields were deserted, and the sheep were left to stray from the fold, and the ripe corn to rot in the field. Another weekly traversed the country, preaching to the children, till the young became fired like the old, and, raising mimic banners of the olive branch, would range themselves, both boys and girls, in battle order, and, armed with sticks instead of swords, march on, shouting aloud the war cry of God wills it. God wills it. Nor did the women escape the fury of the time. Numbers, thirsting like their husbands and their lovers for the blood of the heathen, prepared to follow them to the war. And the most devout of the women put on armor and rode their horses like men. And they were headed by a female chief chosen from among themselves, and called the golden-footed lady, from the gilt spurs she wore. And such was the enthusiasm of the whole sex, that many of them pricked the sign of the olive branch upon their arms, and colored the wound with a green dye, as a lasting memorial of their zeal for the holy war, whilst others, still more zealous, did the same on the tender limbs of their young children, and even the infants at their breasts. And all that had property of any description hurried to change it into money, wherewith to buy their arms. Lands and houses were sold for what at other times had been merely the rental of them, while weapons of war and suits of mail were bought for sums that would have endowed a charity. The nobles mortgaged their estates for mere trifles to Jews, and melted down their plate to furnish supplies for the war. Women sold their trinkets to raise a troop to slay the heathen. And the farmer sold his plough, and the artisan his tools, to purchase a saber for the deliverance of the pilgrims and the conversion of the pagan. Then, as the day drew near for the assembling of all the troops, the roads were flooded with the mighty human tide, rolling on to the place of meeting. Who shall tell the children and the aged that hasten along to destroy the heathen? Who shall count the mothers and the maidens that longed for the fight? And there were 1,000 strange sights to be seen by the way, the poor shoeing their oxen and harnessing them to carts, and placing their children and scanty provisions in them, and then leaving house and home to go slay the pagan, while, as they went, the babes, at each troop they saw, would demand eagerly whether they were the pagans they were going to slay. At other parts of the road, groups of nobles might be seen traveling on, amusing themselves as they journeyed with hawk and hound. Many came down the river in boats and rafts, others trudged barefoot along the rough path, all hurrying on, sword in hand, to teach the heathen to love their brethren as themselves, and thinking it a sin deserving of the wrath of God, to let the unbeliever live. And there was a great jubilee held in Asylum, and the chiefs of the blessed army were to be publicly appointed to their different troops, and solemnly invested with the holy order of the olive branch. And the richest merchants and nobles of the land, with the king at their head, and led on by the dervishes and wells, went in procession to the great mosque. Then, after prayers had been chanted, each chief, as he was chosen, approached the altar and presented his sword to the high priest, who, taking it in his hand, blessed and consecrated it to the service of the Lord. Then, turning to the chosen chief, the priest solemnly warned him of the difficulties and duties of the holy order he was about to enter, telling him that he who sought to be a chief and fight under the banner of the olive branch, must vow never to battle without first offering up prayer, nor to spare either his own blood or the blood of others in spreading the blessed doctrines of peace and goodwill among all men. And he must go forth, sword in hand, to make men learn to reverence the lives of others, and teach justice by injuring 100-fold those that dared to injure. If then the proudest and fairest of the maids of Aswan advanced and armed the new chief, one buckling on his spurs, another placing the helmet on his head, while a third gave him a spear, and when the arming was finished, the noble who acted as his sponsor in arms rose from his seat, and promised and vowed, in the young chief's name, that he should dedicate the sword to the increase and defense of the true faith. And then he struck him upon the shoulder with the naked blade, saying, in the name of all the compassionate, the merciful, I make thee chief, go, bear this blow, but never bear another. And when each of the leaders had taken the oath, and been invested with the order of the olive branch, Aleph, angry to find that all should have taken precedence of Huan Anthe's own brother, drew his jeweled sword from its sheath, and gave it to the chief dervish, saying that he himself would be sponsor for the dwarf. So the priest called publicly upon Huan to come forward and take the oath and receive the weapon blessed from his hands. But Huan, though his heart bled for his sister's fate, could not bear to see the sign of peace made the symbol of war, and refused to take the weapon, telling the dervish that, to uphold the glory of the olive branch, men should break, rather than worship, the sword. Then the chiefs grew indignant at the words, and cried aloud, cast him forth. The brother will not succor the sister, cast the coward forth. But the dervish asked him a second time to come forward and seek a blessing for his sword, and a second time Huan refused, saying, the sword will only drive the pagans further from you, and make them more brutal even than they are. If you would force them from their savage ways, go, make a road between them and you, that you may bring them the closer to you, and distribute among them the knowledge and the blessings that make you better than they. And, as the nobles laughed in scorn at what he said, Huan told them this parable, before man was created, and when the heavens and the earth were without form and void, God made the metals. And he locked them up in coffers of stone, and, setting huge rocks upon them, buried them deep under the ground. First, he made the yellow gold, gorgeous as the sun. And the angels cried aloud, we praise thee, O Lord. Heaven and earth are full of the majesty of thy glory. Then the white silver, chaste as the moon, was made. And again the angels cried, we praise thee, O Lord. Next the copper was formed, red as the morning. And once more the angels cried, heaven and earth are full of the majesty of thy glory. And then he made the iron, gray as night, and the lead, in color like the thundercloud. But the angels grieved at the sight and were silent. And peace bent down her head, and, weeping, cried, make them not, merciful Father. Make them not. For though thou lockest them up in coffers of stone, and didst them in the bowels of the earth, man will find them out and use them to slay his brother, and I and my sister angels will have no resting place on earth. But the angel of wisdom rose up and cried, make them, O Lord. Make them. For man, after a time, surfeited with slaughter, shall, with the iron, set a girdle round about the earth, that will prove a surer safeguard than the sword, and bind tribe with tribe, and nation with nation, till the whole human race shall be linked together by it into one family. And the lead he shall cast into tiny tongues, wherewith the best and wisest of mankind shall speak with their distant brethren, and pour their minds into those of their less gifted neighbors, and, making their voice heard by it far beyond the cannon's roar, shall tell the whole world of the wondrous beauty and bounty of thy works. Then the angels, repenting, cried, make them, O Lord. So that peace may dwell among men forever, and the earth be full of the majesty of thy glory. But the people would hear no more, and seizing the dwarf, they bore him from the mosque and placed him on a scaffold, in the sight of the assembled multitudes. And they broke the sword that Aleph had given him before Huan's face, and the olive branch was torn from his hands and dragged through the dirt, whilst the heralds proclaimed his ignominy to the world. Then the chief thrice demanded his name, and, as the herald each time cried aloud, Huan the dwarf. The priest answered, a base and heartless coward. Next hot water was poured upon his head, to wash away the memory of his honor, and after that he was placed on a hurdle and drawn back to the mosque, where he was covered with a pall, and the funeral prayers were chanted over him as one dead to glory and to fame. But Huan bore the scorn and insults of the people without a murmur, for he only thought how he would go forth, unarmed, among his poor sister's barbarian foes, and teach them the same doctrines as had softened his own heart, and changed him from the savage to the man of peace. He, the dwarf, would go forth, as the kindly spirit bade him, armed with his simple olive branch, and, by the very might of his weakness and the magic of its peaceful power, make more glorious conquests among men than with the weapon of war. Early on the morrow the whole host encamped without the city. As far as the eye could reach, the meadows of Asalon were covered with tents. And as all those that joined the army had been promised by the priest full remission of their sins, thousands gave themselves up to the most unbounded licentiousness. The glutton feasted and the drunkard caroused, and the gambler played till morn. Debauchery flourished throughout the camp, the vice being only exceeded by the superstition of the people. But the holiness of the enterprise was to wipe out all trespasses, for the same eternal bliss was promised to the sensualist as to the anchorite who fasted from the rising to the setting of the sun, and such were the charms of the doctrine for the ignorant, that the song of voluptuous revelry and the hymn of prayer rose from the tents at the same instant. At last the countless multitude began their march. At their head went a body of fanatics, who made it a profession to be without money, and they walked barefoot, and carried no arms, and preceded even the beasts of burthen, living only upon roots and herbs, while their rags were loathsome to look at. Next came the nobles, some in bright armor inlaid with gold and silver, and shining in the sun like figures of fire, whilst others, on their horses, armed at all points, looked like statues of bronze. Then came priests, habited in the coarse, woolen garb of the pilgrim, and above their heads floated their banners of purple and gold and rich colors. Next followed the dervishes, in priestly robes, with helmets on their heads and swords in their hands, each leading a motley band of armed merchants and peasants and laborers. After them came troops of women, carrying their children, some on their backs and some in their arms, and others on mules, and, marching with these, were herds of boys, under leaders chosen from among themselves, and called after the names of the principal chiefs. Last of all came the troops, with Aleph at their head and the chief dervish on his right hand, and bands of choristers by his side, swinging their censers as they went, till the air was fragrant with ambergris, and chanting in one voice, "Glory be to God." Whilst the troops, the pilgrims, the peasants, and the rabble took up the cry, and made the air ring with their voices. As the multitude moved on, their enthusiasm increased, and while the greater part hurried to convert or destroy the heathen, the more zealous of the rabble inveighed against the folly of going to slay the barbarian hordes, while they left the unconverted Jew behind. So many of the holy hosts hastened back to Asalon and, swearing fierce vengeance to the Israelite, first mutilated and then slaughtered all those they could lay their hands upon. As the vast human flood rolled on, Aleph and the chief dervish soon found that, despite the exertions of the nobles and chiefs, it was beyond their power to keep in subjection the multitude that followed them, for the greater part of those they led consisted either of the folly, fanaticism, or villainy of the country. Devoid of principle, discipline, or true courage, they swept over the land like a pestilence, spreading terror and famine, and death, robbery and murder journeying with them all the way. At one time they were perishing for want, so that horses and camels, and the very vermin, were eaten as luxuries by the daintiest, and scarce a chief was left a steed to ride upon. At another, when, maddened with hunger and despair, they gained a victory, giving themselves up to frantic revelry once more, and, in the wantonness of their luxury, refusing to eat any but the choicest parts of the beasts they slaughtered, casting away as worthless all the remainder. Now, at the sacking and pillaging of some city on their way, dressed in ermine, in purple and gold, and silken stuffs, and laden with vases of gold, and silver, and precious stones, then, parched with drought and dying with fatigue, casting away first their heavy golden spoils, and then their armor, whilst the women, who still kept up with the army of the Lord, would throw down their babes in the army's track, and roll prostrate on the ground with the agony of their thirst, offering their naked bosoms to the swords of the soldiers, and begging for death. Chapter 19. As soon as Huan on the day of his degradation, had escaped from the hands of the frantic citizens, he journeyed far away, and stayed not till he beheld the sea, like a vast crystal pavement, spread out before him. Then he sought the wildest and most desolate part of the coast, and there, as the waves rippled at his feet, he thought to himself how he could at once save his poor sister's life, and teach his countrymen the madness of their acts. And he prayed his guardian spirit that she would bear him across the sea, to those far distant shores whither Aleph and his fanatic hosts were hurrying, so that he might, by showing kindness to those who had never yet felt the charm of it, tame them before the army of the Lord a time, by the barbarities of war, to make them even more savage than they were. The wish was no sooner uttered, than the spirit begat what the kindly heart desired, and immediately the trees in the neighboring forest fell like reeds to the earth, while others bent down and curved themselves into the ribs and sides of a goodly ship. Then, from the tallest and straightest of the wood, the branches were stripped, till the naked stems stood up as masts for the magic vessel. And the shores, where the ring of the anvil had never been heard, were red with the glare of the forge, and tinkled with the music of countless hammers, as the yielding iron was wrought into bolts and anchors for the loving mission. And all around was heard the hum of a myriad of wheels, as the coarse fiber of the coconut tree was spun and wove into the sails and cordage of the ship. Then, as the tide rose and rose, the waves danced around the vessel, and, lifting it on their backs, bore it in Huan far away from land. And the same kindly spirit that had built the ship, freighted it with loving gifts, and christened it the messenger of peace, while from its masthead floated the dove and the olive branch, as emblems of both its name and object. But Huan, though he traveled by sea, could not reach the shores of the heathen before Aleph and his, the name and flag of the ship that Williams the missionary built, unassisted, at Radiate, in the South Seas, in order that he might visit the savage natives of the other islands. Multitude, who came by land, had begun the war that he had hoped by his coming to have prevented, so that, when he neared the shore, the natives, who might before have listened to his words, were up in arms and screaming for the blood of the stranger. Though it was night, his vessel had been seen from afar by the natives, and, as he stood towards the land, countless lights flickered like fireflies on the distant beach, while in the breeze floated the yells and war cries of the infuriated people that he had come, unarmed, to conquer. But Juan prayed for strength and faith in the power of the Spirit whose servant he was, and, gaining new courage, landed amidst them. Some of them had one side of their face and body blackened with charcoal, others were painted most fantastically with yellow and red ochre, and stripes of all the colors they could procure, while many had their skins tattooed with curious devices from head to foot, and dyed orange with turmeric, and were dressed as warriors, with large caps, adorned with white cowrie shells and birds' feathers. As Juan looked around, he trembled for his rashness, for he saw that the natives were drawn up in hostile array, some with 3 or 4 spears, others with slings, and their belts full of large stones, while others, with torches of dry coconut leaves, danced round about him, shouting and making the most frantic gestures. Many had climbed the trees, to see the stranger, and upon the trunks and astride the branches Juan saw them in clusters, by the red glare of the torches, peeping, with glistening eyes and wondering look, from the rich, dark foliage that surrounded them. Presently, some of them advanced, and, taking hold of his hands, felt every limb, smelt him, turned up his sleeves, to see his flesh, and examined him most minutely. Then, as they again poised their spears, one cried out, "I'll have his cap," another, "I'll have his cloak," and a third, brandishing his huge club, screamed, "Let us kill the hog. Let us kill him." But Juan desired them to put aside their spears and clubs, telling them he had come as a friend to them laden with presents, to teach the blessings of peace and goodwill among men. When they heard this, they tied up their weapons in bundles and threw aside their slings. Then Juan distributed to them pieces of cloth, and hammers, and rib ends, and clasp knives, and blue beads, and mirrors, and fishhooks. Some of the cloth he gave them the natives fastened round their priest, but the holy man tore it in the native teacher Paprika's narrative of his landing at Rarotonga landing of Williams at Manga. Angered from him, and, throwing it on the ground, stamped on it, crying, "Am I a woman, that I should be encumbered with stuff?" Another, to whom Juan gave a saw, broke it in pieces, and, hanging the glittering fragments round his neck and to his ears, ran off dancing through the forest. Pleased with the gifts, the people grew more kindly towards the dwarf, saying, "He cannot have come to injure us, for he brings good and not evil things with him, and hath no weapon but his tongue." Then Juan told them he had come to teach them the knowledge of the true God, so that they might burn the idols of wood, of cloth and of birds' feathers, which they had made and called gods. Immediately a cry of horror burst from the people, and some said, "What, burn the gods? What gods shall we then have?" And others, "What shall we do without the gods?" While the priest cried, "Away with this man to the chief, for he is one of the others that would destroy us and our gods too," and, muttering something to the people, the natives seized Juan some by his legs, others by his arms, and carried him far away into the presence of their chief Fars, the man-killer. This Fars was a mighty warrior, and, as Juan entered, he was seated on a stage stained with blood, eating his breadfruit, with the heads of the enemies he had slain ranged round him. His appearance was awful, his cheekbones were high and prominent, and his countenance forbidding. His whole body was smeared with charcoal, and his long black hair fell like a mane upon his shoulders, while his beard was plaited and twisted, and reached to his girdle. Round his loins was a narrow slip of cloth, through which his spear was passed, and the only badge of his nobility were a few shells and part of an old clasp knife handle, that dangled from the girdle round his waist. Before him stood his mother, weeping, and cutting with shark's teeth deep gashes in her face and arms, to show her grief, while she bewailed the death of her child, and charged the chief with having killed his little brother and sent his body to the priest, because the king had demanded of him a sacrifice to the gods. But Vars only looked up from his feast of breadfruit and abused her, saying, "Is not the favor of the gods, and the pleasure of the king, and the security of our possessions, worth more than that little fool of a brother? Better lose him than the government of our district and the protection of Pro the war god." Then Huan, horrified at all that he had seen and heard, stood boldly forward, and spake to the chief on the wickedness and madness of offering up such sacrifices to a piece of painted wood. And, telling him he had come to teach them the folly and wickedness of war, he exhorted the chief to worship his God, whose word was the word of peace and love. On this Vars rose, and said angrily, "If it be so, why do these strangers come, armed with spears, to preach the word of peace to us, and slaughter our wives and children, to teach us the word of love?" "They have come," said the chief, "to take us by force and make us worship their God, but, rather than yield, we will gather our warriors round us and fight for Pro, who is not more savage than they." Then Huan told the chief no force on earth could make him worship Allah, for that he was a god of kindness, and those who fought his battles must go armed only with love and charity to all, so that men, seeing they sought but their welfare, might receive them as friends, and listen to their words without fear or suspicion. Then, turning to the people, Huan said, "Out of pure pity I come to bring the blessings of these kindly truths to you, before you entirely destroy each other by your wars and the worship of your savage gods. Think, friends, what a life of misery, and strife, and fear, you lead. You cannot go down to the sea to catch fish, or to the mountains to procure food, but you walk the earth in dread of your foes. I come to teach you peace and happiness, that you have never known. You hide yourselves in caves when your priests seek your lives as a sacrifice to the gods. I come to give you the safe shelter of God's love to all his creatures. Your chiefs enter your houses, seize your rolls of cloth, kill the fattest of your swine, pluck the best of your breadfruit, and take the very posts from your doors as firewood wherewith to cook their food. Is there a person present who has not buried his new canoe in the sands, to hide it from these desperate men? I come unarmed and inferring among you, to put an end to these savage wrongs. I come to show you how to live in amity, without fear of your neighbor. I come to teach you to do to others as you would that others should do to you, so that, instead of being pierced with spears, or beaten to death with the clubs of your warriors, or burned as offerings to your senseless idols, you may live and die in peace in your own habitation, surrounded by your friends." Now all this was new to the people, and the interest it begat in those who heard it was intense, for if any moved they would cry, "Be still! Be still! Let us hear!" But the chief Vars rose and said to the priests and those assembled, "The stranger who would teach us this new creed may, like his brethren, want our lands and our wives. I do not say that such is the case, but it may be so. Therefore, do not be in haste. Let us know something more about this new religion of Kindles, before we abandon the religion of revenge, which our ancestors for ages have venerated. Suppose we were to visit his country, and say to his people that Allah was not the true God, and invite them to cast him off and become worshippers of Pro, the god of war, what reply would they make? Would they not say, 'Do not be in haste. Let us know something more of Pro and the worship he requires'? I wish my people to do and say the same as the stranger's people would say, in the same circumstances." Then, turning to Huan, he asked, "Where does your God live?" Huan answered, that heaven was his dwelling place, but that he filled both the sky and the earth with his presence. "I cannot see him," rejoined the chief, "but mine I can look upon and touch with my hand, and, if the earth was full of your God, surely he would be big enough to be seen." And we should run against him," added the priest who had brought the dwarf to the chief's house. To all this Huan made answer, that the earth was full of air, but they could not see it, nor touch it with their hands, that they were surrounded by light, and yet they did not run against it. Then Huan spake kindly to the mother that still grieved for her murdered son, and strove to comfort her, telling her of the happy time of peace and goodwill to come, so that the poor woman, unused to sympathy, thanked him, as her heart overflowed with his compassion. And she brought baked meats and yams, and coconut water, and spread them before him, on a tablecloth of fresh plucked leaves, and bade him eat and drink, saying that she knew he had come to comfort, and not to injure them. After this, she besought her son that he would listen to the stranger's good counsels, and no longer worship as gods those things of painted wood and birds' feathers, that rob them of their children and their brothers. And she exhorted him not to lead his men to battle on the morrow, but to stay with the stranger and hear more from him about the God of peace and loving kindness. And, when Huan had finished his meal, seeing him overcome with fatigue, she spread a mat for him, and, bidding him rest his tired limbs, placed a bundle of dry grass as a pillow for his head. As Huan prayed before he slept, Vars hearing him say, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, as we have mercy on others," wondered at the charity of the prayer, and, drawing his mat beside the dwarf, told him he had come to be taught to pray to the God of mercy. Delighted with the request, Huan repeated the supplication, while the chief said it after him. But when Vars had made him go over it again and again, Huan, overcome with fatigue, dropped off to sleep. Scarcely, however, had he closed his eyes, when the anxious chief awoke him, saying, "I have forgotten it, tell it to me once more," and, when he had made him repeat it many times, Huan fell asleep again, and was again awoke. This the chief did frequently through the night, till he had got the prayer by heart. And, as soon as the air grew blue with the coming morning, he bade Huan wake and talk with him, saying he had been thinking seriously on all he had heard, and felt greatly disposed to burn his gods, but was afraid lest they should be enraged and strangle him in the night. But, as it was a matter of great importance, it was well not to be in haste. However, since Huan had come for the purpose of dissuading him from fighting, he would lay aside all thoughts of war for the present. Then the dwarf, finding he had made a friend of the chief, ventured to speak upon the subject that he had not dared to mention before. So he asked Vars if he still remembered the prayer that he had learned, and the chief repeated it to him word for word. Whereupon Huan told him that he alone, of all his countrymen, had come in mercy to them, though none had suffered at their hands more than he had. Then the chief asked him how he and his people could have injured one whom they had never seen before. So Huan told him they had robbed him of his sister's life, and, though his countrymen had called him coward, still he had come to them in charity, to teach them those blessed truths which had taught him to live in peace with all men and love his enemies. And Huan wept bitterly. When Vars heard the speech, he fell back and gazed with wonderment upon the dwarf. Then, suddenly starting up, he cried, "Now do I see that yours is the true God. Had you slain my sister, I and my children's children would not have rested till we had made your skull our drinking cup, for I should have bequeathed my vengeance as a legacy to my sons, and commanded them to have blood for blood, even though they had to wait for it till the third or fourth generation. But you, instead of injuring us or our wives or our children, have come amongst us laden with gifts, to pay back good for evil. Truly, yours is a religion of mercy, and none but the true God could have made it." But Huan's heart was fixed on Anthe, and he asked the chief if, among those that had been slain, he remembered one that was blind. And, when Vars answered that he did, the dwarf inquired if she had suffered much. But the chief replied that the blind were sacred with them, for that, if they took their lives, Maraka, the goddess of darkness, would be angry with them, and destroy them as they slept. Then Huan's head fell on his bosom, and he sobbed for very joy, while he praised God that Anthe still lived. But Vars thought he grieved for the approaching fight, and cried, "Oh that your countrymen had come to us in charity, as you have done. But they came as enemies, and fell upon us with the sword and the firebrand, under cover of the night. And they slew our priests, our wives, our brothers, and our children, till the dead covered the earth like trees after the hurricane. They desecrated our temples, cut down our sacred groves, tore Pro from his seat, stripped him of his robes, and set fire to our altars and our gods. And, when our people saw the green fields and trees dyed red with the flames of their gods and the blood of their countrymen, they screamed for vengeance. And they sounded the trumpet shell of war, and called on the tribes around to destroy the ruthless strangers, saying, "There is no peace for the god-burners, till they have felt the fury of the fire with which they destroyed Pro." Chapter 20. As the chief yet spake, the sun rose, and suddenly the trumpet shell sounded, and the air was rent with the cries of the priests and the yells of the warriors, as they gathered together. Then the shouts ceased, and there was heard the chant of the priestesses of the war god, singing of the victory to come, while from afar, floating on the breeze, came the prayer of the armed hosts of Asuan. Then Huan, led by the chief, hastened down the mountainside to see if there were no way left to stay the coming strife. But, as the war cry again came up louder and fiercer than before, he looked down into the plain beneath, and saw the barbarian horde assembled in the vast waste which their forefathers, the war at Radiate, had set aside for their battleground, with their war caps on their heads, and their long, jagged spears, set with shark's teeth, ready poised above them, while, drawn up behind the savage horde, stood bands of women, bearing baskets of stones, and slings and clubs, with which to supply the warriors as they fought. So Huan hurried on with greater speed, and reached the plain as the boldest of the chiefs started forward from the ranks and began his war dance of defiance close in front of the army of Asuan. Now the savage chieftain quivered his spear, and ran to and fro, leaping and shouting, as though inspired with the spirit of wildness. Then, with a bound, he stood before his foes, and gnashed his teeth, and grinned at them, till he foamed at the mouth, all the while keeping up a low, hideous howl, and forcing his eyeballs almost from their sockets. Then, calling them women and children, he defied them to the combat, while he thrust his long, grey beard into his mouth, and nodded with savage vengeance. And when the people of Asuan saw this, they cried aloud, "Death or new life to the heathen!" And, brandishing their swords on high, rushed forward to the fray. Then Huan fell on his knees, and, remembering the magic power of the branch he bore, waved it in the air, as he called on the spirit of kindness to help him save the murderous hat of Olaf and his host, so that the arms they carried might be changed to the instruments of peace, and, gaining greater power from their greater kindness, theirs might be a victory of the heart and not of the sword. Immediately the shouts and the war cry ceased, and the fanatic foe became the earnest friend. The spears were turned into pruning hooks and the battle axes into plowshares. The armor fell from the limbs of the zealous host, and the bigot warrior stood transformed into the apostle of peace, coming with sickles instead of swords in their hands, wherewith to teach men to live in happiness and plenty. And, in the magic of the change, the girdle of scalps fell from the pagan's loins, and his naked and painted limbs became clothed, while the uplifted club dropped harmless from his hand. And those whose brains they, in their savageness, had come down to offer up on breadfruit leaves as food for their gods, they no longer feared as enemies, but now gathered round in faith to listen to their words. Then, as the kindly teacher spake, the sky grew crimson with the burning of the pagan temples, as if the heavens themselves were stained with the blood of their 1,000 victims. And the people were seen advancing in procession, tribe after tribe, the chiefs and the priests leading the way, and men, women, and children following them, bearing their rejected gods upon their shoulders. Some of the idols were large, some were small, some were beautiful, while others were hideous. Here was carried the great god of death called Tongara, the man-eater, whose priests were supposed to be inspired by the shark, holding in one hand the spear with which he killed men, and in the other a net, with which he caught their spirits as they fled from their bodies. There was born another, whom they called Tao-J, the god of thunder, and he held a mighty fan, and had wings, the sounds made by the flapping of which as he flew, they said, caused the thunder to peal through the skies. Next was brought a rod, with snares at the end of it made with the fibers of the coconut husk, with which the priest caught the spirit of the gods, and which was also used in wartime to catch the god of battle by the leg and secure his influence on the side of his worshippers. After this one was carried Pap-O, the god of revenge. This was made of rotten matting, and round it there hung a string of pieces of polished pearl shells, which were thought to be the soul of the idol, and he was regarded with great veneration, so that those who sought his assistance would cut off with sharp shells the joints of their little fingers. Then the idols were rolled towards the fire, some of those who had worshipped them a short time back kicking them as they went, saying, "There! Your reign is at an end." And, when they had cast all but Papo into the flames, one of the priests, lifting up the roll of rotten matting that they called the god of revenge, begged with tears that that idol might be thrown into the sacred tank hard by, as drowning was a less painful death than burning. And when, to please the simple one, they had granted his request, he tied a stone to the idol, and, weeping, cast it in. No sooner was the last of the blood-stained gods destroyed, than the magic of the olive branch went on, and from the sacred groves there came the sound of many axes, and the loud crash of boughs and branches falling to the earth. And the breadfruit trees were seen to drop one by one to the ground, and where they had stood rose up the milk-white walls of the humble temple of the new god. On its roof were the leaves of the sugarcane, on its floor were the leaves of the coconut, and the steps before it were of hewn coral, both white and red, while the path that led to it was strewn with shells of many colors. And all around waved the stately breadfruit trees, with their dark green, glossy foliage and their light green, oval fruit, hanging like balls of emerald from the end of every bough. And interwoven with their branches were the white leaves of the candle-nut tree, while, overtopping all, were seen the graceful plumes of the coconut. Through the thick, green foliage peeped the snowy walls of the House of Peace, dotted with drops of sunlight trickling through the leaves above. Across the sunbeams flitted bright-colored butterflies, like winged flowers, and the cooling breeze from the ocean swept by, laden with spice and perfume. Then was heard the ringing of the call to prayer, and men were seen beating, as they went, battle-axes with large stones, to summon the people to the temple. And, as the teachers entered the holy place for the first time, their hearts were moved at the sight of the change that had been so wondrously wrought in the people, for the jagged spears of the savage chiefs were ranged as balustrades, to support the rails around the altar, while from the rafters hung the rejected idols, as trophies of the bloodless victory that had been gained. And when they had prayed, a chief arose and said, "Thus the gods made with hands shall perish. There they are, tied with cords. Their glory, look. It is birds' feathers, soon rotten, but our new God is the same forever. Friends, let us remember our former state, how we slew our children, how, when age made our mothers helpless, we would tempt them to the woods, and then, hurling them into a hole that we had dug, would cast heavy stones upon them, and how, when we came to manhood, we would fight and wrestle with our fathers for the mastery, and, if we obtained it, take forcible possession of their goods, and drive them from their home to starve, and how, when the hand of death had snatched the husband from the wife, we, instead of visiting in kindness the fatherless and the widowed in their affliction, waited to seize all that belonged to them, and turn the disconsolate mother with her offspring away, and possess ourselves of the house, the food, and the land that was theirs. Now, friends, none are to be pillaged, none are to be destroyed. But some are still doing as we have done. Some are still killing themselves, and others their children and their parents. Some are still worshipping their bloodthirsty idols. Let us, then, send them teachers, to teach them the good word that we have been taught." Next an old priest stood up, and holding out his hands, moved rapidly the joints of his wrists and fingers. Then he opened and shut his mouth, and raised his leg and moved it in various directions. And, having done this, he said, "See, I have hinges all over me. If the thought grows in my heart that I wish to handle anything, the hinges in my hands enable me to touch it. If I want to utter anything, the hinges in my jaws enable me to say it. And if I desire to go anywhere, here are hinges in my legs to enable me to walk thither. Now, I perceive great wisdom in the adaptation of my body to the wants of my mind, and when I look into the book of life, I see wisdom in it equal to that in my frame, and my heart tells me that the maker of my body is he who therein commands us to love our brethren as ourselves." Scarcely had the priest finished, when a body of natives rushed into the temple, dragging with them a chief they had taken in ambush. As they forced him forward to the altar, they cried, "See, great Marietoa, we bring thee thine enemy at last. Now, take thou thy vengeance on him." Then Marietoa rose, and advancing to the captive, said, "Thou didst take my child as thy prisoner in war, and pressed her to become thy wife. But she would not consent, and even thine own people said it was base in thee to take by force the daughter of a chieftain like myself. Upon this, thou didst seize thy club, and, swearing that if thou didst not have her no one else should, didst strike her on the head and slay my only child. Now my blood urges me to avenge the death of my girl, but I have learnt the religion of peace, and I will begin by trying to love thee, my bitterest enemy." Then the chief, who had come prepared for death and torture, was stricken down with the charity of his enemy, and, as his head fell upon his bosom, he cried, "I will unite myself to this new religion, for it is one of wondrous mercy, and I know, by my life being spared, that none but a great and good God could have made it. Plus henceforth, Marietoa let us two have but one heart." And he fell at his forgiver's feet, and buried his face in his hands. Then the noble chieftain took his enemy by the hand, and said, "Rise, brother. Tear off the garb of Satan and be a man of God." Huan thanked his guardian spirit for the wonders she had worked in the hearts of the people, and, calling Vars to his side, he bade him conduct him to his sister Anthe. So Vars led him far into the once sacred groves, till they came to a thicket dense with trees of ebony and ironwood, with their black boughs and leathery leaves so closely matted together, that the herbs beneath grew white as in a cave, while, as they walked along, the screech owl and the vampire bat darted like shadowy imps in and out the branches. At length they reached the Hall of Darkness, sacred to Maraka, the goddess of the night, within whose ebony doors and blackened walls no ray of light had ever entered. Beside it grew the nightshade, and all around glimmered dim glowworms that never ceased to shine. When Huan heard that beneath this dismal roof his sister was imprisoned, his blood chilled with horror, and he thanked heaven for the blindness that screened the terrors of the dungeon from her. Then Huan, as he waved his magic branch, besought his spirit to wipe out the black blot from the earth, and let the light of heaven shine for the first time within the walls of darkness. Instantly, the branches above opened, and the light streamed in a golden flood through the leafy lattice, till the earth was drenched with it, and the walls grew white, and the grass grew green, and sparkled with many-colored flowers, as though, where each sunbeam touched, a gem was left behind. Then the sides of the vast building were pierced with many windows, and, as the light poured in, there arose from within the buzz of 1,000 infant voices, humming like a swarm of bees, as they hide the honey in their brains. Some learned a thanksgiving for their food, others a simple prayer to say before they rose or slept, while, above all, was heard the gentle voice of Anthe, telling the little ones the wondrous story of the life of him who first taught and showed mankind how to love their enemies, and do good and lend, hoping for nothing again. When Huan entered, he found the people gathered in the hall, and dressed as for a feast, to listen to the children. At their head sat the gray-haired old king who had been worshipped as a god, and had led many fierce warriors to the fight, but his glistening eyes showed that he felt more glory in that peaceful scene than in all the battles he had won. As the little ones lisped aloud the kindly lessons, it was a touching sight to look upon the faces of the parents gathered round to hear those very infants learn to hurt nobody by word or deed, and be true and just in all their dealings, whom a little while since they would have destroyed or dedicated to Gyro, the god of thieves, that they might have become clever and desperate in plunder. Here were some aged listeners, whose eyes glistened with delight, as the mother said to the father, "Thank God, we spared our little one." There sat others with saddened countenances and faltering voices, who bewailed in bitterness that they had put theirs to death, while the silent tears, as they trickled down the cheeks of many, told the painful tale that all their children were destroyed. Jubilee of children at Radiate. F. Polynesian custom. Suddenly a woman in the crowd started up, and, as she wrung her hands, she shrieked, "Oh, my children! My murdered children! All the little ones I have slain rise up in judgment against me. My sins! My sins! There is no hope for a wretch like me." Then, as she sobbed aloud, she continued, "Even my little firstborn I put to death. My second my husband would have saved, but I and my mother cried aloud for its life. My third was more beautiful than all, and its father's heart yearned towards it, and he begged and entreated it might be spared to him, but I and my mother again had our murderous way. We rose in the night, placed its little body in a hole we had dug, covered it with a plank, and left it there to perish. Oh, my babes! My murdered babes!" Plus scarcely had she sat down, before the brother of the king, a chieftain grey with years, rose, and, as he beat his breast, he cried, "Let me speak! I must speak! I will speak! Oh that in my youth I had known what I now know in my desolate old age! Oh that I had known that these blessings were in store for us! Then I should have spared my children, and they would have been among this happy group, repeating these precious truths. But, alas! Alas! I destroyed them all. I have not one left, no, not one." Then, turning to the king, he cried, as he stretched out his arm, "You, my brother, saw me kill child after child, but you never stayed this murderous hand." And then, shaking his clenched fists at the idols that hung in contempt above their heads, he cursed the gods he had but lately worshipped, saying, "It was you that bred this savage spirit in us, and now I shall die childless, though I have been the father of 19 children." And the tears trickled down the old warrior's cheeks in his bitter agony, like the sweat drops of his soul.